by quite a few people today, doing something new, something we've never tried before, which is a panel discussion on free speech. I was talking to Murad yesterday, and Murad had this idea that why don't we do a discussion on free speech? There's been a lot of kind of blowback to ex-Muslims in general. There's been a lot of like controversy with people like Almin Nawabi. Like, should we even be talking about these things? Like, look what happened. People were killed. Muslims were killed in cold blood. Are you guys responsible for this in any way? Are you guys not responsible, but indirectly responsible or contributing to the problem? What is the framing on free speech? What are the limits of free speech? Or should there be limits, or should there be no limits of free speech? I feel like in our circles there's a bit of people tend to lean towards there should be no limits on free speech, but what are the consequences of having no limits on free speech? So to discuss all this, I'm joined by four friends from all over the world. I'm Abdullah Sameer. I'm in Canada. I'm an ex-Muslim for 4 years now. I grew up in Canada, fairly liberal leaning, but I don't have any particular left or right kind of connection. I just go with what I think is right. So could you guys just introduce yourself? So Murad.
Hello everyone. My name is Murad. I left Islam well over about 20 years ago. Wow. And this whole idea of free speech and its impact on people, it fascinates me. And also I think some of the recent events have, given me a lot of concerns around the debate. So that's why I wanted to chat to you guys, get some, good deep perspectives from you all.
Shariq, so I had Murad on a while ago, and I had also Shariq on. Shariq, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yes. My name's Shariq Siddiqui. I'm here in London. I'm originally from India, from Mumbai. I've been here for a while in the UK. I've done a call or two with Abdullah Sameer by now, so maybe you've seen me. But very quickly, yes, I'm also an ex-Muslim, and I also have faced similar questions in my mind about free speech, as Murad mentioned. I also don't have any particular leanings or any sort of ideological
underpinnings,
underpinnings, exactly, left or right. My views tend to end up more left of center than right of center, but that's not how I come up with my views. So I'd like to think that I'm thinking about things issue by issue. So I just thought this would be an interesting discussion.
And Imad?
Hi, so I'm Imad from the UK, and I'm also an ex-Muslim for about 4 years now. And I come from a much more sort of Salafi, strict practicing background. And yes, I think this whole debate about free speech and the limits of free speech is something that it's needs to be debated, really, and I think that's why I'm looking forward to this conversation with you guys.
Okay, and Kane, could you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Kane, also an ex-Muslim from the UK. Similar to Imad, I grew up in a fairly strict Muslim household, and I'd say I was a practicing Muslim up until my early 20s, maybe even late 20s. A lot of doubts after that, and I think I probably officially left Islam in my early 30s. It's an honor and a privilege to be on this panel with four such distinguished guests.
Thank you so much. So, Murad, would you want to just go to just some thoughts on, just to get this started, like what we were discussing before the call?
Yeah, so one of the things I've seen, a consequence of what happened in Christchurch, was a furious and heated debate in one of the groups that I admin. And the debate essentially demonstrated a real schism between people who are strongly for free speech and almost to the point of being free speech absolutists, and the other half of the group saying that there must be stronger sanctions against people who promote hate speech. And it seemed almost impossible for people to see eye to eye, for people to find any kind of common ground in there. And I think that's a wider reflection of society, especially here in Australia at the moment, because of the fact that the shooter was Australian, he was white. His manifesto, has been banned in places, or people have tried to suppress it. The video, all of these kind of things were coming into play. And now there's this wider kind of fallout where you see that things like Jordan Peterson's book has been pulled from shelves in shops in New Zealand and has somehow been linked to this, some kind of guilt by association. But at the same time, because I'm for free speech, I think it needs to be defended. The idea that people can speak their minds and be honest about what they believe might be horrendous issues in society, or with governments, or with religions, or with any kind of group that has power. But the flip side of that is the words that people say can have huge impact on the actions of people. So, for instance, this guy who went and shot 50 unarmed people, so the impact of our words is important, and I'm not a free speech absolutist, and I guess that's what I wanted to kind of get from you guys is, okay, well, what are the different perspectives? What do we need to protect? And do we protect words more than people, essentially? And I think one of the other things that I see, and I find it quite flippant and a little bit banal, is this idea from free speech absolutists, is this quote. It's kind of like a mantra, really, where people say good ideas will beat bad ideas. And I think, well, do good ideas stop bullets? Literally, do they prevent atrocities? And do sometimes worse ideas overtake bad ideas? So, yeah, I wanted to put it to the panel and just see, okay, well, what are your thoughts on it? Where do we start from? Where are we trying to shape the discourse over this? Because it's really heated, and it's obviously dangerous for people at the moment. So, over to you guys.
So I'm thinking if whoever wants to jump in, just jump in, and we'll just go from there. Since I've already started talking, I mean, I have a bit of a platform now, and honestly, like, it scares me. It honestly scares me because I've always, even as a Muslim, there's a different type of fear as a Muslim. Like, I was scared that I'm gonna misguide people and they'll go to hell or something. But even today, like, I'm scared to say the wrong thing because, like, I have to be responsible. I have to take ownership for, like, what happens because of what what I'm saying. If I'm continuously saying, Islam is bad, but I'm also saying, I also believe Muslims should have the rights to freedom of worship, freedom of expression, freedom of belief. I don't believe in this discrimination. The Universal Declaration for Human Rights is one of the best things that we have, and we need to make sure that nobody is discriminated for, even, for example, wearing hijab or, wanting to pray at the office or whatever, as long as they get the work done, within reason. I always say that, so because I don't want my words to be used by some evil person to say, oh, because of this guy, and I decided to kill these, and and the language we use, like the guy used the word invaders, right? He used the word invaders, and there's it's such a tricky topic, because at what, like, where's the line? Where do we draw the line? Like, so whoever wants to jump in, just jump in.
So hi, it's Imad here. I did a little bit of research into, when I say research, a little bit of reading some time ago on the evolution of free speech, the free speech debate in the US legal system, in how the courts in the US have interpreted free speech and what we can say and what we can't say. And that's something worth looking into. I mean, it may be a bit too much, and I can't rely on my memory enough to sort of give you names and details in a debate like this. But I think where we've ended up in the US, where they've ended up in the US, because I'm in the UK, is what's, in terms of the limitations of free speech, tends to stop with actual provocation or to violence, or actual provocation to demonizing that could lead to violence. Whereas you can criticize the government, you can burn the flag, you can decide that you don't want to declare allegiance to the US. So I think that the problem with free speech and where the lines lie is one of definition. It's one of identifying where you've crossed the threshold from expressing legitimate concerns, criticisms, and viewpoints to actually provoking others to act in a negative way, and that's the difficulty. I think as Christopher Hitchens is quoted to have said once that the problem with restricting others from expressing themselves is that you also restrict yourself from listening to another viewpoint and another sort of thought process, which is, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. So there are lots of aspects of looking at the whole debate on free speech, and I'd like to hear your guys, your views on how you see these different aspects, as opposed to, I can see where you're coming from in that, most of the general debate tends to be about do words lead to violence, but I think we need to break it down from that and identify what do we mean specifically, when we're talking about words and people's views.
Mm-hmm. Just to jump in, just based on the comments I'm seeing, I wasn't saying that we should ban. I was just saying that, so there's a difference between saying what should be legal and illegal, and saying that I want to be responsible with my words. So that's all I was saying. It was my own conscience speaking, that whether it's my words are used for to justify violence, or not even that, it just in general, like, I don't want to misguide people to something that's wrong. That's why I'm always reading books and developing myself. That's like a personal thing. Kane, what do you think about this whole topic and the limits of free speech and hate and stuff like that?
So, Kane here. I think you made a wonderful point just then about taking some measure of personal responsibility when we say what we say. And I think if everybody did that to at least a small extent, that we reflected on what we were going to say and we put it through a filter and tried to understand the repercussions of our speech, that would go a long way towards dealing with a lot of the issues we have. And I'm also glad you raised the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If I can just say for a second, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's recognized in international human rights law as well, says that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference And everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art or through any media of his choice. Now, I think that's a wonderful covenant to have. I think it's absolutely superb. And I don't think there's many people I've met who have any issue with that. In fact, the only people who do have an issue with that tend to be theists, who have an issue with, because obviously they'll have blasphemy laws and they don't support the right to that kind of free speech. But here's the important thing: there's not much disagreement there. But then later on, there's an amendment to Article 19, which says that the exercise of these rights carries special duties and responsibilities, and may therefore be subject to certain restrictions when necessary, for respect of the rights or reputation of others, for the protection of national security or of public order, or of public health or morals. Now that's it. That's the crux of the argument. That's what we need to get into. Now, it's a wide-ranging topic, and there's a lot of subjectivity there, but that's what we need to break down and try and understand. Where are those restrictions? How do we enforce those restrictions? Who comes up with those restrictions? And how do we constantly measure and monitor that there's not an excess of control coming from one particular area? And I think, a lot of people laud John Stuart Mills as one of the founders of free speech, or certainly in his book on liberty, it's one of his one of the most passionate arguments he makes is about free speech. But he also has what he calls the harm principle, in which he says that we should all be allowed our liberty, but the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So this is it. We need to determine where that harm originates, so we can then put restrictions in place.
Nicely said. Nicely said. Anyone want to add to that? Jump in.
Yeah, Shariq. I don't really have any disagreements with anything anyone's said so far. I think what's coming out of all this is that I think there's general agreement that there's some sort of limits that we do need. Some may not be limits, but some sort of restraint, whoever applies it, that needs to be in place with free speech to the point that it doesn't do harm, it doesn't lead to incitement. But my issue with all this, it's not an issue, it's just something that I need to resolve in my head. Who do we trust enough to put those things in place? It's all right to think that we all self-regulate, but can we? And if we could, and if we knew how to, and if we had a shared understanding of what these limits, where the line lies, then we probably wouldn't need to have this debate at all. So who do we trust? And is it the government that we trust? And which government? Is it the UN? And what do you do when you want to criticize them? So those are the questions that I don't know the answer to. And one other thing is that this assumes that the recipient is always wholesome in their interpretation, that the people listening to this speech will always interpret it the right way, always receive it the right way. So I think that has implications even for good speech, whatever we may consider good speech to be. I just get the feeling that we can't even good speech doesn't seem to be good speech can go the other way. And does that therefore mean that? Sorry, getting a bit of an echo. I hope you aren't getting an echo when I speak. So does that mean that critical thinking is where the answer lies? That we have to just propagate the notion of critical thinking that people can apply to their own thoughts, their own views that they express, as well as whatever is incoming. So I don't know the answers. I don't know the answers to these questions. And the last point I'd like to include at this stage is we have a truth. We do have filters in terms of harm, but does there need to be a truth filter, a truth and intent filter? So, and again, how do we apply that? And do we even agree on what truth is? So, for example, Alex Jones of Infowars, I'm using a bit of an extreme example, when he says literal lizard people are I'm paraphrasing a bit, but literal lizard people are running the world. Does he believe that? And does it matter whether he actually believes that if it's simply not true? And who's the arbiter of that sort of thing? So, and if to use another extreme example, if somebody says the Earth's flat, and they genuinely believe the Earth's flat, then maybe it's okay to say so. But if they're doing that for political gain or monetary gain or something like that, does it then become bad? At what point does it become bad speech? Is it okay to be crazy if you genuinely believe it's true? Who's applying the? It all comes down to whose limits are these? Who's applying the limits? Is it an overarching authority, or is it each individual receiver of the image? And can we trust either of these parties to do it properly?
There's a couple of other examples I can think of. The other one is Facebook is now banning anti-vaxxer pages because of the harm that's happening, because of the global rise in measles cases, stuff like that. So and someone's asking, keeps asking, what about the Quran? What about banning the Quran? The Quran is hate speech as well. What do you guys think?
I'll speak to that, because that was an exchange that I saw between two people, in the group. One person saying we need to ban hate speech, and the other person said, well, do we consider parts of the Quran hate speech? Because there's definitely a point of to be made about the bigotry in there against non-Muslims, the sword verse, etc. Just there's plenty of examples. And I guess that's the thing, again, which goes back to what Shariq was saying of who's the arbiter? How do we judge? How do we all get to have some input into these things? Because it's a very fine line, and there are endless accusations of double standards. People saying, well, if we ban this, then we're going to have to ban that. And where do we end up? If there's preachers in mosques or churches or wherever saying that non-believers are evil, and are we to ban them as well? Are we to start monitoring everybody to see what they're saying, what they're thinking, what happens in those kind of cases? So people have been banned in Australia recently. I think Milo Yiannopoulos was banned from coming to Australia. David Icke, famous lizard person, was banned from coming to Australia. Is it true that the banning of people and the banning of speech, the banning of their words, drives things underground, makes people a little bit more extreme? Alex Jones has been banned from various platforms. Do I support that? That's a really, really tricky question. This is I think the crux of it. Do I support certain people being banned? And I guess it depends so much on power structures for me, because if I think of, say, I'll give an example of speech that I think was instrumental in, say, an atrocity, and that's coming from my history, having been born during the Liberation War in Bangladesh in 1971. In 1971, General Yahya Khan said, if you kill, so many number of Bengalis, then the rest will be eating out of our hands. And when I see things like that being said, I kind of think, okay, well, there is a causative factor in massacres, and I'll kind of draw a link to what happened in Christchurch with speeches that have been made by people here in Australia. whether it's things that have been said on the radio about Muslims and Lebanese people being grubs, or whether it's Fraser Anning and he's an MP here in Australia, a senator, and he, in his maiden speech in Parliament, he actually used the words "final solution" for the immigrant population. He used the words "final solution," and there was an uproar about that, saying, "Well, if that's your kind of free speech, that's the power of your free speech, and you're using it in Parliament with no sense of responsibility, I think, no sense of responsibility of what the impact of your words might be." And I think that's a dangerous thing. And that's my point about how do we draw the limits? And as Shariq said, who's the arbiter? Who's the ultimate arbiter there? How do we prove that having speech like that has consequences?
Yeah, it's a difficult question.
So,
go ahead.
Kane here. Do you mind if I just expand on what Shariq said?
Go for it.
Yeah, I just want to add, I don't know if I necessarily have any answers to what he said, and I'm not sure that any of us will come up with any concrete answers by the end of this. But I know many of you have heard the motive of a marketplace of ideas. So it's often said that there's this realm, and if it's left to operate on its own, it'll drive out prejudice and falsehood and produce knowledge. But what you have to understand, this notion, and it's like a free market in general, is predicated on this utopian concept of consumers. And when you think of the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, the assumption is that conversation works by exchange of reason. That when one party offers its reason, we are then countered by the reasons of an opponent until the truth ultimately emerges. The problem is that this isn't necessarily how it works, because conversation isn't just used to communicate information, it's also used to shut out perspectives, to raise fears, and to heighten prejudice. Sorry, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, so this argument for the marketplace of ideas, there's a presupposition there that the words that would be used only in their descriptive sense or their logical sense or their semantic sense. But in politics, and especially I'm thinking now with the rise of fascist politics, language isn't simply used for that purpose, it's also used to elicit emotion. So I don't think we have this utopian concept of just leaving this marketplace of ideas. And then I think somebody raised the issue of conspiracy theories and theories like the anti-vaxxers and stuff. When you leave people with emotional rhetoric to reach out to people who don't have knowledge, it isn't the strongest argument that wins. It's the one that that affects our emotions the most that tends to win. And it's how do we deal with that, which I think is also a big issue.
Yeah, it's Imad here. I'd just like to throw, it's highly unlikely we're going to come up with solutions in this debate. I think we're raising a lot of concerns and a lot of questions, and I think that's how this debate will progress. I think eventually at some point we'll come to some kind of understanding. But I think that one of the biggest factors here is the human factor in terms of when you talk about the marketplace of ideas, you're talking about consumers. In this debate of free speech, you're talking about human beings, individuals, and you've got to take into account intelligence, education, IQ. All of these factors come into the argument. So when you have when you have the World Wide Web, when you have huge differences in education and IQ and EQ between people, you don't have that. You're not going to have that platform where necessarily the best ideas win out. I think what will happen is that the loudest arguments, the ones that are pushed the most, will win out. I mean, to give you a sort of slight analogy, is I think somebody once said that the American elections, you can almost predict the outcome based on the amount of money that's being spent by the candidates. So the candidate that has the biggest budget and spends the most amount of money is almost certainly likely to win the elections. And I think it's the same with ideas. Oftentimes it's what catches the public imagination and what gets promoted the most and is the loudest that wins out. And that is an issue. I don't know what the solution is. So that's what I want to say on that.
Kane here, that's a really good point with regards to American politics, because there was such a divide with Obama's healthcare plan. But if you wanted to have that debate, it seemed almost impossible. Because it wasn't just a debate about whether the benefits of the health policy, it became a debate about whether Obama was an undercover Muslim spy seeking to destroy the United States. And so when you're having that debate based on that kind of rhetoric, the two people aren't even they're not even engaging in the same argument. It's not about the merits of the health policy anymore. One side is looking at it as this devious anti-democratic agenda, and that the healthcare is just an offshoot of that.
If I can just butt in there, it's Imad here again. From Islamic background, if you look at the principle of taqlid, of if you don't know, ask the man who knows. I think that's kind of the philosophy that huge numbers of people generally follow. They tend to follow. They tend to sort of subcontract understanding a topic to others and follow others. So I think where you have opinion, I think you have in society generally, you have opinion formers, people who will go out and have the knowledge, the ability to convey that knowledge to others, and they tend to be the ones that sculpt opinions. And I think where you started off, Abdullah, with saying that you have a platform and that gives you a sense of responsibility, and you need to use that responsibility carefully. And I think that is when you talk about sort of restricting free speech, I think we have to look at it from that angle, if that makes sense, from looking at the right to free speech of people who are opinion formers and who hold platforms, and look at it from that angle.
That's Shariq here, just jumping in. I think Imad has raised an important point there. It ties in with identity politics as well, and that's what I've been noticing a lot of going on of late, where people seem to be deciding how they feel about certain ideas not based on their own analysis, not based on their own reasoning, but based on where they think their allegiance lies. So, for example, if we take what's happening in New Zealand as an example, there was so much solidarity expressed with Muslims in the immediate aftermath of the very unfortunate attacks. But it assumes that, well, we are liberals and therefore we must stand up for the underdog, and Muslims are the underdog. Clearly, in this case, Muslims have been attacked, and therefore now we must stand up for them. And by that same token, anyone who says I am an Islamophobe is automatically wrong. There's nothing to be discussed there. And authors such as Jordan Peterson, who I must say I'm going to put my hand up and say I'm not the biggest fan of, but just because he's standing next to someone who's expressed a sentiment like that on a t-shirt, and therefore it's okay to immediately restrict the speech of anyone associated with that. So this is clearly not coming from a place of reason. It's not coming from a place of critical thinking on the part of the receiver of the message. Forget the person putting the message out there. And this also goes back to the point that Kane made, that the economy is a very good metaphor. We have this myth of free markets resolving everything, but in practice we find that they don't, because it isn't a utopia of economic actors who are always acting rationally and truthfully, and to maximize their own welfare and everybody else's welfare. You have collusion, you have monopolies, you have misinformation, you have just the way in the US elections, you can determine which candidate wins by how much of a marketing spend they have. You can pretty much predict which brand of soft drinks or which brand of beer is going to be consumed the most based on what their marketing spend is, and not necessarily on its own merits. So, and likewise, consumers, and also and stretching the analogy to information, to the marketplace of ideas, the people who receive the communication, the common every person, it's a myth that everybody is responding rationally. If it was that we express an idea, the other person uses the Socratic method or whatever to examine the idea and truthfully express their position with no agenda and with a perfect understanding of history and semantics and logic and logical fallacies, then maybe we could actually get to the truth. Well, we just can't make that assumption. So, and unless we build those skills in absolutely everybody in that discourse, and we assume honesty on the part of everybody pushing out any bit of information, when I think about it like this, I become extremely cynical about whether we can have any sort of good speech. Forget hate speech, or forget killing hate speech or stopping bad ideas. I just wonder if we can ever get to good, wholesome ideas and understand truth, reality, or ponder the big questions. So, I don't know the answers to
that. Kane here. Just wanted to add to that. I know all of us must have heard at some point someone say, "I'm attacking the ideology, I'm not attacking the people." It just seems to be this catch-all now for excusing saying some of the most controversial stuff that they know will incite under the guise of attacking ideology rather than people. And on the surface of it, it actually sounds correct. We shouldn't argue against that. Why should we not be allowed to attack ideologies? If we can't attack ideologies, we can't. We'll never be able to determine how strong they are, how they compare to others, and get to some measure of truth. The problem is that again, it comes back to this idea of a utopian society. That's not how reality works. In reality, we can't just attack an ideology and it won't affect people. It just doesn't work that way, because people's identities are completely wrapped up. A Muslim doesn't the Muslim offended. My entire identity is wrapped around, you've attacked that, you've insulted it, but I'm absolutely fine. It just doesn't work that way. So the thing is, we have to work in the realms of reality. We have to be pragmatic. We can't just, sort of live in this utopian world and say, this is how reality works, but we're just going to argue this way. It doesn't work that way. And it's unfortunate, because we're seeing a lot of it with ex-Muslim activists, and this may be a little bit controversial, and I guess a lot of them are being accused of this now, but there is a lot of this dangerous rhetoric. And let me give you an example, and let's see what you guys feel about it. If somebody says, say it's an ex-Muslim activist, and they are saying on whatever forum they use, the Muslims in the mosque on Privet Drive are dangerous. They believe that apostates should be put to death. They believe that homosexuals should be thrown off buildings. They believe that women should always be covered and have no rights, etc., etc. So the Muslims in that mosque are such a way. If you start to say stuff like that in a public forum, people will say, yeah, absolutely, that's bigoted and that's prejudice, and you're likely, it's a form of hate speech, and you're likely to rile people up to do something. But what's the difference if you say Islam is being practiced in that mosque by Muslims? Islam says throw homosexuals off buildings. Islam says women don't have any rights. Islam says apostates should be put to death. That is the ideology, and there are Muslims in there that are following that ideology. Now you've almost in a semantic sense distorted it and made it about the ideology. But what's the difference? Are people now suddenly going to look at that mosque and say, oh, there's absolutely no threat there? So I'd love to hear your opinions on that and how that subtlety doesn't actually make a difference.
I do agree with you in some sense that a lot of ex-Muslim rhetoric is over the top, it's very blunt, and it doesn't achieve the point. Like, one book I read, written by an ex-Muslim, said something to the effect of like, all Muslims should either join ISIS or leave Islam because ISIS is true Islam. This idea of true Islam, this idea that there's only one Islam, is part of the problem, I think.
I'll speak to that because that's reminded me of plenty of things that I've seen where ex-Muslims have said, things along those lines where they've essentially made a monolith of all of these Muslims, of 2 billion people, as if they're one kind of giant collective, whereas there is so much diversity within Islamic circles, within Islamic communities, within all of the countries across the world. You think about how differently it's practiced in so many places, and I think that conflating of everybody who is Muslim with ISIS is a dangerous path, which is why people in so many countries think, oh, once Muslims come, then they're all going to be like ISIS. And I think that's which it goes back to the idea of, does free speech need to be true speech? Do we lose sight of the nuances, the shades of grey throughout the world, throughout people, throughout communities, when we settle for pretty poor rhetoric like that? Because it gets views, it gets likes, it gets controversy points, and people love controversy points. It's great clickbait, isn't it, to kind of use that? And I see ex-Muslims do that a fair bit, and it makes me shake my head, and it's difficult to counter, especially when you see the number of likes that people will pile onto things like that. The endless sort of reward cycle that people get into, that dopamine cycle reward of, oh, if I say this, people like my comments, I'm going to say that. And you think, oh, look, who are you appealing to? Like, hugely bigoted people, often, but still some people who might be a little bit more nuanced about their understanding of what drives people. The thing that Kane said as well I think is important, that it sounds a bit fluffy to say of separating the ideology from the person. It's kind of like, if your kids do something wrong and you say, I love the child but I hate the behaviour, it's a little bit parochial, a bit paternalistic kind of thing, a bit simplified. Because, like Kane said, it's difficult to extricate the person from their beliefs, because sometimes it feels so wound up inside us. I would have found it difficult when I was a Muslim to kind of be able to separate that, especially when I was younger, to kind of understand that I am not merely a collection of my ideas or my thoughts or my opinions on something. There's more to that. There's more shifting, there's more changing, there's evolution in how I've grown up. So learning that about myself makes me think about other people and how people have shifted and how they change, and how I shouldn't abstract people to such a point, because they're flesh and blood, and they have a whole life story. Each individual person has a whole life story behind them, and to just push them into this little container that says Muslims and then say anything in this container is bad and everything outside the container is good, is, it's ludicrous, really.
Yeah, I can't help but agree with all of that. I think the place where the disconnect starts to happen, I'm just going to go back to what Kane said. What's the difference between saying Islam throws gays off roofs, or saying Muslims go to mosque where they practice Islam and Islam says let's throw gays off the roof? I think the fallacy being made there, in my opinion, those statements are almost exactly the same, because we're saying what we're basically saying is that all Muslims are completely congruent with all of Islam, and that's where the problem happens. Again, we're starting to say all Muslims are the same. Like I said, it's not a monolith. No one's examining, well, does every single person in that mosque believe that gays should be thrown off roofs? Is that their understanding? Or does somebody think, oh, it shouldn't be a building, it should be a mountain? Somebody said, well, it should be in a river. Or somebody said, oh, let's not throw anyone off anything at all. So you'll find a whole diverse range of opinions. The problem starts to happen when you start extending it to, millions and millions of people. Well, that's the bit that people seem to struggle with. I think it shouldn't be controversial at all to say that most Muslims believe to a great extent in Islam, which we can all agree has a lot of problems, and we need to address those problems, rather than saying that every single Muslim lives and breathes to propagate every single problem in Islam. But that sort of nuance, unfortunately, it takes a lot of engagement, a lot of thinking to get to that point, and which is where I also despair when I see it's bad enough what the outright bigots say, but when it's atheists and ex-Muslims doing that sort of thing and just being lazy about that, just for the dopamine points, dopamine hits of the likes and comments and follows and shares. I'm not even anywhere as active as Abdullah Sameer, but whenever I criticize Islam, for example, or I'm from India. I'm very explicitly from India. I have no shame of any sort being Indian. When I criticize Pakistan, I did it this morning, I start to get lots of likes and I start getting lots of friend requests. And the minute I have any sort of criticism of Hinduism or the government in India, then suddenly I become Muslim, and suddenly I become, oh, you guys and your victim mentality. And so everybody starts judging information based on the package that it's coming in, and assuming and then extrapolating assumptions about a huge group of people in both directions, from the general to the particular, from the particular to the general. This one Muslim did this, therefore all Muslims must do this, and this is what Islam believes, and therefore all Muslims must believe this. And that's just absurd. We should just, I wish it was as easy as taking every action, every communication and examining that on its own merits. I know I keep banging on about this point, but I would like to see a world where we can always push towards that. And that's why in every sort of discussion, any sort of engagement with people, whether it's online or in person, I'm always trying to push for examining the matter at hand and not bringing everything else into it. And speaking of bringing everything else into it, it's happening in the YouTube chat as well. What about Saudi Arabia? I mean, I actually find that as a very good way to save time in any discussion about free speech, about religion, about human rights. Just bring that in early on. What about Saudi Arabia? And once people have got that out of the way, then maybe we can get to some honest conversation. I'm just so tired about this, tired with this sort of this kind of whataboutery, when the discussion starts to get too nuanced, or you feel that there might be some information coming in where I might have to think about things differently. Maybe this person's making some sort of point here. Move the goalpost and start talking about, oh, what about that thing over there? What about this really extreme thing which will get us all worked up emotionally? And I think in that sense, my own viewpoint is that yes, to an extent, good ideas can only be countered by bad ideas. I don't know about only, but good idea. Sorry, let me come again. bad ideas needs to be countered with good ideas. Now, I don't know whether that's the only way to do it, but certainly good ideas help. Now, the question is, are there enough good ideas out there to counter all the bad ideas out there? Are people interested in the good ideas, or are they interested in what gets the blood flowing, whether it's a good idea or bad idea? So that's something we're going to have to learn. I don't know
Yeah,
what you guys think about that.
I do sometimes.
Kane. Oh,
Let me just say something first, and then you can jump in. I do sometimes despair with the general state of things when I see that, you know, these black and white views that don't have nuance become so successful. Like the speakers were, you know, saying these things, they become so successful so quickly. Whereas people that are using nuance, you know, like for example, a good friend Waleed, Vidu Wids, you know, it's a much bigger struggle to get to where you need to get to, especially if you're like, let's say you want to do this full time. And there's always and then you see people that have like jumped on, you know, the whole demonization thing and like, you know, the whole like over the top rhetoric, and you see how quickly they become popular and how successful they are. You like, it's almost like that meme that Muslims use, that, oh, you left Islam to get rich, or you're bashing Islam to get rich or something. It's obviously not that straightforward and not that black and white, because the vast majority never do get rich from bashing Islam. But you do see that the people that are the loudest sometimes, you know, are able to get to the level where they have such huge platforms, and all they're doing is just spewing out like this empty rhetoric, and you're like what are you talking to? Like, who's your target audience? Because it's obviously not Muslims, right? Like, even some so-called imams are like as anti-Muslim as you can get, and they're calling themselves imams, right? And these people have, like, you know, skyrocketed in popularity. Like at one point in this imam's career, he was more like an actual imam, but now, you know, it's kind of one of those things where like, oh, look, people are responding to what I'm saying. Oh, people like what I'm saying. Oh, I've got 100,000, 200,000 followers now. Maybe I should just keep going on about this. And then it's just like, oh, I got these people, you know, like helping me on this now. So it is kind of sad to see that, but you know, that's how humanity, I think, is. And you know, those of us who are fighting the good fight, we're always going to have to try to pull people back in the middle, right? It's never going to be easy, but I think that's what we need to do. Kane, you want to say something?
yeah, I just wanted to add to what Shariq said. The people that are in the camp of Islam, and again, I use Islam as the monolith that they tend to. Islam is evil camp. They frame the argument in such a way that they can't possibly be defeated. And by that I mean, what they will say is, they will say the people that follow what they think is Islam, which is this violent ideology that leads to extremism, they are the true followers of Islam. But then all the people that don't follow it or are peaceful and are not extremists, they will say, oh, they've used their innate morality, they've used their logic and reason to override the Islamic message, so you can't win. It's a lose-lose in both situations. Islam is evil. That's the context in which they're framing it. And now let's judge the Muslims based on that, which is a completely lopsided way to look at an argument. And it's the way that they do it. And it's extremely intelligent people that can't seem to see that. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, it's this, you know, true. These people are, you know, what they'll do is they'll take, what they want to do. Some people, what they want to do, and I've seen ex-Muslims want to do this as well. They will try to say that these people are not following true Islam, and then what they'll do is, if something bad happens, they'll say, oh, look, these are moderate Muslims. So they'll take like an extreme example of something someone did, right? And they'll say, oh, look, these are moderate Muslims, right? Whereas what they're doing, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, like, you know, all Muslims are, like, you know, internally some sort of like evil people, but look, these guys are the exception. And they always try to bring it back to this like true Islam, which is this barbaric, evil, monstrous thing. And then, but the thing is, they can't accept that there's people that don't believe in all that, and they just, you know, Islam is a religion like any other religion. It has good and bad in it, and people will select and decide, the parts that appeal to them and the parts that don't appeal to them, and even scholars do that, right? So in the modern context, obviously, like 95% of these horrible things, sex slavery, and like all of those, jihad, most of these things will never apply to the majority of people. So the challenge is for people like us that want to, like, it depends, like, what's your goal, right? Like, is your goal to help Muslims, or is your goal to get a lot of fans, right, and to become popular or whatever? If your goal is to help Muslims, then you're not helping them if you're straw manning their religion. If you're straw manning their interpretation, their practice, the religion, right? Like vast majority of my family, if you went and told them, like, I'll give you an example. There's a popular Christian guy that has a online show, and what he does in this show is he'll mention, like, for example, like things that I find very strange. For example, he'll say that Islam is racist against blacks, and what's his evidence? Evidence is, so then I was like, on this show, I was in the comments and I was asking, like, what's your evidence for this? Because as a Muslim, as a practicing Muslim, I always believe that Islam is against racism. And I have, like, so many examples. Like, yes, Islam does create this sort of system. Orthodox Sunni Islam creates a system where believers and disbelievers are at different levels. So it's replaced racism with another sort of type of caste system now, where a believer is higher than a disbeliever. But nevertheless, if you're going to talk about racism, let's talk about racism, not that other thing. Islam and racism, like, to me, Islam took away racism because it made Bilal, the muaddin, the caller of prayer, he was a slave, he was an ex-slave. For example, Zayd ibn Haritha, who Muhammad adopted, was also a slave, right? He was someone that was kidnapped in a war or whatever, so he was at the lowest rank, right? And he became the son of Muhammad. He was adopted, right? So there's so many examples. And Zainab, for example, who he married, he got her married, and she was a high class. He got her married to this ex-slave. Again, that's like breaking down the caste system. That's breaking down the barriers that the old society used to have, right? And so when someone says Islam is, like, racist against blacks, I'm like, what are you talking about? And then this person came up with this example from Ibn Kathir that says that when you go into hell, your face will become blackened. Or the Quran says that. I was like, what on earth? Does this have to do with racism? And then they come up with some sort of tafsir, Ibn Kathir, that there's a hadith in there which I've never ever heard of about racism or something like that. And then it's like, well, I never heard this, and I'm a practicing Muslim, and I was a practicing Muslim for half my life, and I deep dived into Islam. So how is it that Islam is teaching this when you, a non-Muslim, are telling me this is what Islam teaches, and I never ever heard this before? And I'm like, what? You're strawmanning Islam. You're making, and it's not only like Christians, like some ex-Muslims do this. They will tell you what Islam is, even if that's not what people are following and practicing. You know what I'm saying? And that bugs me too, because what you've done is you're not connecting with people, right? You're making up an Islam that maybe was practiced back then, but it's not the Islam that people are practicing today. And then you're like projecting it onto people and saying, oh, this is what Muslims are following and believing in.
I just want to, this is Imad here, I just wanted to add, I've used the word fake Muslim, ex-Muslim a few times, and I think that the reason I do that is because if you have been deep into Islam and you've practiced Islam all your life, you know how controversial and how divided Muslims can be between Hanafis, Brelvis, Deobandis, Shafis, Malikis. You know that a Brelvi will not pray behind a Salafi. You know that not long ago you had 4 Jamaats at the Kaaba. So you had the Hanafis, the Malikis, the Hanbalis, the Shafis, all praying at different times on different faces of the Kaaba, the 4 faces of the Kaaba. So you know that there's never been one uniform Islam, and if you've been a practicing Muslim, you will know that what one Muslim or one sect of Muslims believe will be completely different oftentimes to another sect. So then to say that you're an ex-Muslim and then say, actually, all Muslims are like this, is at one level a sort of, extreme ignorance. It's ignorance, and another level, I think it goes back to what Murad was saying. It's basically clickbaiting. It's saying something controversial to get an audience and get a cheap audience very quickly, because we know there are huge numbers of people out there. The Hindutva crowd in India. You've got the sort of the right-wing Christian crowd in America. You have people in the UK, in Europe, the nationalists, the right wing, who are basically looking for examples and reasons to hate on Islam, because they have ultimately, deep down there's a racist agenda there. To attack Muslims is essentially to attack brown people, I think, generally. So yeah, I think that's a very important point you've made there. And I think what you're saying about, within Islam, there are things, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote that an Arab is more Afdal than a non-Arab, i.e. because the Prophet is Arabic, the Quran is Arabic. But that's the opinion of a Muslim scholar who was very controversial and limited to a region. And if you take quotations from individuals at specific times and then try to say, well, this is the broad brush understanding of the majority of Muslims and all Muslims are like that, I think, again, it comes down to being ignorant. And I think all people like yourself, Abdullah, and others who are sort of more nuanced, I think all you can do is sort of bring that forward to people and tell people that this is just not true. There isn't just one Islam, just like there isn't just one Christianity. I mean, you only have to look at history to see the violence between the different sects of Christianity. And Hinduism isn't one Hinduism. You have so many different castes. You have so many different factions within the religion. So yeah, that's I wanted to say that.
So I just want to say one quick thing, and then I'll let other people talk. These people don't usually say all Muslims are like this, but they imply it. They imply it that they're all, like, for example, potential like terrorist jihadis waiting. It's just, you just have to wait for the right moment, and then boom, they're gonna come out, and you're gonna have halal meat everywhere, and the whole you're gonna have halal meat, and you're gonna have muadhin, blasting down while you're sleeping in the UK, and you're gonna waking up, and it's like, time for prayer, guys. Everyone has to go pray now. Although there is some legitimate fears of the culture changing, and in a bad way, but I think overall things are quite positive. The way I see it, being an ex-Muslim in the West, I've seen a lot of progress, what we would call progress, and I'm quite happy for that. But yeah, do you guys want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to say, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say something a little bit funny. The apparently majority of meat in New Zealand is actually halal because they export most of their meat to the Middle East. So I think in New Zealand people are eating halal anyway. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll just say water is also halal. Just they've been drinking halal water all that time and they didn't know it.
And sorry, one more thing. I just want to. I have to say this. The reason we're talking about Muslims, because people might ask, well, why are you going on about Muslims, and Muslims are not evil and blah blah blah. The reason we're talking about Muslims is because they tend to be they are the primary followers of Islam, and if we ex-Muslims are talking about Islam mainly, because that's what we experienced and that's what we lived, Muslims are tangentially connected to that. So we need to say these things, like, obviously I don't need to say anything about Hindus, and I don't need to say anything about, Christians or whatever, even though I do think there's good and bad people in all groups, and I do say that. But we do need to, it's almost like a responsibility and a necessity that we continue to clarify that while we're against Islam, we were Muslims too, and we have Muslim family, and there's we need to talk about Muslims for this very reason, not because we're still Muslim, not because we're Taqiyya Muslims, not because we have some special allegiance to Muslims over anyone else in humanity. No, we have allegiance to all of humanity. Of course, we were Muslims and we do have Muslim family members, so we're connected in that sense, but not as a theology. Like I have no connection to Muhammad. You know, people still say, oh, you still have connection to Muhammad or something like that. Like I don't love the man. I don't even know the man. Like what I know is I don't know the man. What I thought I knew of the man, I didn't know. Now I know I don't know the man. So no, I don't love the man. Thank you very much. That's all I have to say.
So how about, I mean, we've been looking at this from the side of bigotry against Muslims for the last few minutes. How about the other end of the spectrum? I'm going to put my Mossad agent hat on now. And do you think that it becomes too easy? And usually this comes from the progressive liberal side of the spectrum. When I say progressive, liberal, leftist, I'm using these terms very loosely. What I mean broadly is not right, or not right of center, more the left of center sort of argument. That let's not say anything about Muslims or Islam at all. Let's just never criticize anything. When parents in Birmingham and now in Manchester in the UK say, "Oh, we don't want to teach our children that some people are gay and that's okay," and then that gets accepted because let's not anger Muslims. When Muslims are clearly indulging in regressive practices, I'm going to take FGM as an example. I'm not for one moment trying to suggest that when I say FGM, I mean female genital mutilation, also called female circumcision, whatever you want to call it, female cutting of little girls. I don't believe that's a practice that originates from Islam or is unique to Muslims, but is it prevalent amongst certain groups of Muslims, certain sects of Muslims? Absolutely. And to shy away from that debate, for a long time in the UK, people were unwilling to say something about that because it's a cultural practice. We shouldn't look racist when we criticize Muslims. We should just never say anything. We shouldn't question anything Muslims do. We shouldn't question really long breaks that Muslims take at workplaces to go and pray, because it might upset them. And this is a bit of a silly example. I'm a photographer by profession. I was at an event with some photographers, and we started discussing with somebody about wedding photography, which I don't do, and about Indian weddings and Hindu weddings. And he asked me, "Are you a Hindu by any chance?" I said, "No, actually, I'm more from a Muslim background." And he said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you in any way. I really didn't mean any harm." And I was like, why would you think that I'm going to be offended by that? You're just trying to understand who I am. But there seems to be this fear that never upset a Muslim or he's going to go and blow something else up. This is completely contradictory to my experience of most Muslims. And most Muslims are perfectly capable of having debate, perfectly capable of defending their positions, whether they're regressive or wholesome or not. Now, how do we avoid this sort of thing happening as well? So on the one hand, we have the Tommy Robinsons of the world saying creeping Sharia, no-go zones in the UK. On the other hand, we have people saying, well, don't ever question Muslims and don't ever criticize Islam. And how do we come to a reasonable debate? How do we achieve that? And that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about these days. And there's this, which brings me to this term, which is very relevant at this point in time, is Islamophobia. Now, there's laws being put into place against Islamophobia, and we need to be clear what this term means. This happened in Canada, this is happening in New Zealand, to an extent in the UK. Now, what does that mean? It becomes a free speech issue. Are all of us suddenly criminals now because we say, well, these things are bad in Islam? And are we distinguishing this from anti-Muslim bigotry? Now, there is a case to be made that does it really matter what the difference is between Islamophobia versus anti-Muslim bigotry, while what we're actually fighting is anti-Muslim bigotry. But when we see in practice, what happens is that ideas are getting crushed because of hate towards people. Well, it's the hate towards people that should be stopped. I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing to say. Some people may disagree. I do find that, especially online, anything short of advocating outright genocide of Muslims is not acceptable to people who become a taqiyya agent or secret Muslim or something like that. Unless you're saying kill Muslims, get rid of them. I think we can agree on this panel that that's clearly wrong. But how do we distinguish between this when it comes to ideas? I think this is going back to the point Kane was making earlier, that do we need a change in terminology? Is that helpful at all? What do you guys think about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry in the context of, say, Christchurch?
I do think it's important that we continue to speak out against all bad cultural practices, all bad ideas in general, no matter who's going to be offended or not offended, FGM, or whatever it is, homosexual rights, homosexuals not having rights, all of these things we do need to, and that's such a good point, because like you said, we've been talking about, for the most time, about bigotry because of what happened in New Zealand, but like we need to also continue to say and continue to speak out against bad ideas, which is why, in my case, that's one of the reasons why I'm an activist, is because like I think these things need to change, and I think people need to see these things. So that's I do think that's a very good point you made.
I'll speak to a point that I've seen in Australia around that, the hypersensitivity towards discussing practices or abuses, especially within Islam. And this is a important point, but also it kind of blew my mind when I saw it. So recently, a few years ago, we had a Royal Commission on institutional childhood sexual abuse. So institutions that had allowed or had propagated childhood abuse, abuse towards children. There were thousands and thousands of submissions to this Royal Commission. It took years to run. And I had a look through quite a few of those submissions. I'd worked in, with groups before who had groups of men and children as well, through when I was doing my psych nursing, or hundreds of people over the years of people who've been sexually abused. Quite a few of them made submissions. People I know made submissions to the Royal Commission, and there were virtually no submissions from Islamic communities. The Jehovah's Witnesses were there, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, synagogues. It's a smaller population than the Muslim population in Australia, and it kind of blew my mind, because I was just thinking, statistically speaking, you're going to have similar numbers really across communities. It's not like it's just one area that it happens in. But if there's one thing that I saw from that, and one thing that I took away from that, was that if there's one good thing Islamic communities can do that is a very, very powerful thing, is the code of silence. There is a code of silence around the abuses that imams do, beatings in mosques, all of these kind of things. And the code of silence is intensely strong. I don't know, I think of like just stories about mullahs and Maulvis in Pakistan or Bangladesh, and just a litany of abuses that never get spoken about. So that code of silence is a very powerful phenomenon. And I think what the numbers and the stats that the Royal Commission showed me was there's got to be a stronger sense of silence within Islamic communities compared to other communities. And that kind of, that just struck me as very, very strange. It's such an anomaly that it made me think, what's going on there? And
Can
why
I
did
just
no one kind of speak about it? Yeah, go on.
Just quickly, I think that's part of the whole purity culture there, that honor culture, and that even gets, in a way, you can say, that the emphasis on women having to be pure and all that, and I guess men too. Maybe that's part of it, and that's obviously a bad thing, right? Sorry, you wanted to talk, Imad?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that's very interesting, because I think the code of silence and not it goes back to Islamic teaching at one level, because Islamic teaching does talk a lot about hiding the faults of your brother, hiding the sins of others. There's hadith about if you hide the sin of your brother, then God will hide your sin, etc. And I think it's something. There's a lot of emphasis on not talking behind people's backs, not bad mouthing other Muslims, and protecting the honor of the Muslims. So I think what Abdullah said there is true, in that a lot of but I think that's in Asian culture as well as in Islamic culture. I don't think that's particularly restricted to Islamic culture. I think in a lot of Asian cultures, there's a lot of honor associated with women. So if women are sexually abused, you do not reveal that fact, because that then makes that woman unacceptable to society. And I don't think that's something peculiar to Islam. I think that's generally a thing that's sort of universal amongst a lot of cultures. So people tend to hide abuses against women. But I think the thing about hiding the faults of imams and brushing it under the table, and I think I've been watching a lot of controversy in Pakistan and in Bangladesh with a lot of sort of a lot of Bengali speaking YouTubers, where they've done some research or interviews with people who've gone to madrasas and have been abused. And one story that comes out again and again is that oftentimes the madrasas where there's been abuse, where boys have been abused sexually or however, it's oftentimes the madrasa will take the option of hiding the abuse and sacking the imam, or sacking the mullah concerned, rather than sort of making that public, because the way they look at that is one, it's it affects the reputation and the image of Islam. It affects the reputation and image of the madrasa, and also it affects the reputation of the profession of being an imam and a mullah. And underlying all of that is, I think, the general kind of principle taught in Islam that you don't talk about other people, you don't expose their faults, you hide the sins of your brother or your sister, and I think that has a role to play in what you just said there, Murad.
I just want to say that at least if they're firing the imam, that's much better than the institutionalized covering and relocating of Catholic priests, which is so disgusting. Like, they should have been cut off from the job. They should have been fired immediately, and that should have been the end of the career. Even if they settled it privately, I mean, it would have been better if it went through the law system and people actually saw these people for who they were. I was listening to a podcast about this, and how this because of the ability to be alone with these kids, and because the Catholic Church was protecting these people, like a lot of people with these tendencies would have gone into these jobs, right? Like becoming a priest or whatever. Not to say that all priests are like that, but the system is messed up, right? And it's unfortunate, because if someone is a child predator, whether the imam or the priest, like we need to know that as a society, right? We can't just cover that up. But yeah, like you said, unfortunately they hide it. But at least it's not as bad as when you have a system where you can just go from place to place,
Yeah, well, I'd agree with you there. I think with what's happened in the Catholic Church, where there's systematic cover-up from top down, is definitely a lot worse than sort of unplanned and localized hiding of misdemeanors.
Kane here. Can I just go back? I know we moved on from the topic slightly, but can I just go back to the issue of Islamophobia that Shariq raised? for me, it has to be one of the most exasperating non-issues that there is out there in terms of that word or that term. It really is just a term, and you can use any term and you're going to have exactly the same issues that you have now with Islamophobia. So let's say, hypothetically, Islamophobia just didn't exist. It just wasn't a term. And we decided we were going to use anti-Muslim bigotry as a term for people who spoke out against Islam or Muslims. Do you think then that people won't get accused of anti-Muslim bigotry when they don't deserve it? Of course they will. That's exactly what they'll get accused of every time they talk about Islam as an ideology and don't attack Muslims. Some Muslims will still accuse them of anti-Muslim bigotry. And how do they defend themselves? In the same way that they defend themselves when they get accused of Islamophobia. There's no issue. Just use the term. If you get accused of Islamophobia, then defend your position. Exactly the same thing will happen if the term anti-Muslim bigotry is used. It's just about settling on a term. So I don't see that as an issue at all. I just wanted to say that.
I think the fear is you may be actually right about this. I think the fear is that it conflates, criticism of Islam with actual bigotry or hate of a group of people. I think precisely because of this term being what it is, Islamophobia, is why there was so much backlash. So in Canada we had this motion passed, which was M103. So in New Zealand, 50 people were killed, and they did, what did they do? They banned automatic weapons and semi-automatic weapons. They wore headscarves. Some of the women, for including the they played the adhan, and they did so many things. Now in Canada, which is supposedly progressive country, all we wanted to do is one of the Muslim MPs, Iqra Khalid, passed a motion, not even a law, a motion, to condemn Islamophobia after, I think 7 people were killed in the Quebec mosque. Like, inside the mosque they were killed, right? And, this is, horrific, right? This is so bad. And all they wanted to do is condemn Islamophobia. It's not a law. Nobody's going to jail. They just wanted to condemn it, right? And basically what they meant, if you read it carefully, they meant anti-Muslim bigotry, not criticism. But when I first heard about it, there was so much hype about this that I was freaked out. I'm am I gonna go to jail for my blog? Is my blog now illegal? My blog has nothing to do with Muslims, has everything to do with Islam. Well, in a sense, Muslims are connected to Islam, but I'm not hate mongering, I'm not fear mongering. I'm just talking about Islam. I'm talking about slavery in Sunni Islam, Orthodox Sunni Islam, and talking about all these things in the Quran and all that stuff. But I was genuinely scared, and there was so much backlash to this. I just think it ended up being counterproductive. There were people protesting outside of schools that criticism of Islam is now going to become illegal. I don't know how many people have told me that Canada has banned criticism of Islam. I'm like, no, they haven't. Calm down. They didn't do that. But I think it's precisely because of the term. I don't know if someone said we want to condemn anti-Muslim bigotry, you would have to look like a complete asshat to say, I'm protesting because I want to be a bigot, right? And I think Islamophobia, it exactly means anti-Muslim bigotry. That's exactly what it is. But unfortunately, the term itself is awkward.
Yeah.
I think it is just, it feels like it is just semantics. And of course now the term has been co-opted by the right as a weapon to use against what they call extreme leftists. So I think you're right. I think it is just a word thing. And the people who are saying, let's eradicate Islamophobia are in essence just saying, let's eradicate anti-Muslim bigotry.
Interesting point. Coming back to Australia with what Abdullah said, and further to what Kane was saying about the word and bigotry and Islamophobia, the differences. There's a politician here, George Brandis, who a couple of years ago said people should have the right to be bigoted which I thought, does anyone know if that's ever been kind of enshrined in law? Like that somehow in the, Declaration of Human Rights, we should put, you have the right to be bigoted, as if it should be protected by law, that you can be a bigot. And that was an interesting comment from him. It was around discrimination laws here, and they were trying to repeal certain parts of an act to essentially allow people to be, more bigoted in their speech on public television. There was a case surrounding it as well, so a test case. So I thought that's interesting that people want the right to be bigoted, and a politician as well. So I guess it's strange what people think are their rights.
It's so bizarre.
Some good stuff there to unpack, Murad. I'm still working my head around that. Is the right to be an arsehole a universal human right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. I don't know the answer to that. I wanted to raise a related issue, which I don't know if it comes up often enough in free speech discussions. There's free speech, and then there's repetitive badgering of free speech. And the sort of thing I'm referring to is the Goebbels model, which I think has been practiced with some great success by the ruling party in India right now. Obviously, there's no way of proving it, but to very quickly summarize that, there are some alternative free speech and leftist activists in India who managed to hack the WhatsApp delivery mechanism that the IT cell of the ruling BJP party has, where allegedly they circulate messages that the key messages that need to be tweeted that day to an army of hundreds or thousands of people in India. So what they did was they hacked that file, the Google document that gets shared through WhatsApp for the tweets of the day. And then they saw that the same tweets were then being tweeted hundreds of times. So it's the same message being broadcast from various accounts. It obviously becomes much easier to do online, but it's not always different people doing that. And this has been noticed in the past, even before these activists hacked into that Google document, because you'd see the exact same message with the same typos in place being not retweeted, but tweeted by hundreds of different accounts. Not to pick on this one example, I'm just using this as an example. It is repetition, needless repetition, and badgering also one aspect of free speech. Is there some sort of proportionality we need to have about different views? And on our YouTube chat itself, I'm an admin of the chat as well myself, and the other viewers didn't miss that I temporarily silenced one of the participants for simply just making statements without any interest. But didn't look like they had any interest in discussion, just lots of statements just very quickly following each other. So is there some sort of proportionality that needs to be introduced when it comes to free speech, about different views coming in and allowing a space for different views? And in doing so, if the answer to that is yes, then in doing so, how do we avoid giving equal opportunity to all kinds of stuff? So if somebody is saying, oh, not Muslims are evil, then do you need to bring in exactly one other person who says, kill all Muslims? I'm just using an example. If we're having a discussion about evolution, then do you necessarily need to have somebody, exactly one other person who says that, oh, the Earth's only 6,000 years old? So how do we achieve that balance between? I think I find that balance quite easy to achieve in my personal life, in my personal interactions with people, by listening to people when they seem like they've had a bit enough of me, or when others are struggling to speak or feeling a bit intimidated into not speaking. I'd like to think that with a bit of introspection and observation, one can do that. But I don't know if people are doing that. And again, this is such a subjective thing. This is such a subjective thing. And I also admin many groups online, on Facebook, elsewhere. I do moderate many things. And if you ask me to articulate my rules for moderating things, I don't know if I'd be able to do that very easily, even though it's very clear in my head. So if I'm raising the issue and I don't know how to do that, how to put the rules down on paper myself, is it possible to do that when everyone has a voice?
So yeah, just to add a little bit more to what you said, this non-stop individual in the chat that's going on about Islam is evil, Muhammad is evil, like on and on and on and on. Guys, like, we get the point. Again, like, where are you going with this? Who are you talking to? Are you talking to yourself? Are you talking to Muslims? Muhammad was evil. Muhammad was evil. Muhammad was evil. Okay, like, he knows you think Muhammad is evil. Nobody cares anymore what you think. You've shown that you can't get past the first point. Okay, let's get past that. Another question in the chat was, what do we expect from Muslims when it comes to free speech? I think for me that would be, I expect that Muslims would allow us to have the same freedom of expression that they have. So if you're allowed to preach your religion, and we asked the question, but we didn't. I don't know if he answered it, but I was going to say no. We shouldn't ban the Quran or Islam or anything like that. I'm not into this sort of fascism that we control everything, every single thing about a person's identity and what they believe and what they want to practice and what they want to do with their life. As long as they're not hurting anybody else and they're not imposing on anybody else, freedom of speech is there for them and it's protected. But they need to also give us the same freedom of speech. Also, we shouldn't lower ourselves to the standards of like others that we are also criticizing, which is ridiculous. So, for example, Saudi Arabia doesn't allow churches, so we should ban mosques. Like, are you stupid? Like, you want to be like Saudi Arabia? Then what makes you any better than Saudi Arabia? You become just like them then at that point, right? So if you think they're so morally bankrupt, then why are you saying just because they do that we should do that? Doesn't make any sense, right? Yeah, so that was my answer for that. And Kane, you wanted to add something as well? You wanted to say something?
Not specifically for that, but I just wanted to make one last sort of concluding remark. I think we're going to tie up quite soon anyway.
Yeah.
So this is going to sound almost paradoxical considering we've just spent 2 hours discussing free speech, but I actually don't think there's any kind of free speech crisis going on. I don't think it's actually a major issue. I personally think it's a manufactured issue at the moment. It's almost like a Trojan horse being used by, I think, for me, the right wing to play the victim card, because what they use most often is hate speech, and they want to do it under the cover what they call so-called free speech. So they manufacture this free speech crisis, and I think it's just a self-serving myth. And you see people like Tommy Robinson who can now, under that umbrella, spout whatever they want to say, and that's what they want the freedom to be able to do. And I think it's also, and it's no surprise to me that it's so often being argued by men, often by men in privileged positions, because I think it isn't just that they want to like I said, make hateful, sometimes racist or prejudiced remarks, but there's almost like another insidious thing where they want the idea of patriarchy and misogyny to not be eliminated, to continue in the culture, and they see it dying out. So this is another way for them to be able to force those ideas on a society that's becoming more liberal and that they're becoming more and more lost in. And I think one of the big issues, and they continue to point to issues like the collapse of free speech at college campuses, etc., especially in America. Again, these are myths, because if you look at the studies, you'll find that most people are becoming more and more tolerant, even in college campuses. And there are studies on that, which at some point I can pass on to Abdullah and he can post. But again, they like to point to those specific, and they'll use examples which are in the public eye, where certain maybe famous people or recognizable people have been deplatformed as an example of this crisis, which I don't believe exists. So I just wanted to make that as a concluding remark, that I don't think it's a huge issue, and I think it is being co-opted by certain people on the right to for their own agenda.
I think Tommy is an interesting character to bring up because I wasn't sure about it myself, and then I've seen now, some of the stuff he's tweeted. Unfortunately, all of his tweets were deleted. Well, unfortunately, at least for the sense of a case study, I'd like to see. There were other websites. There was a website that was called like Twitter Cache or something, that was actually like saving all of the tweets that people made, even the deleted ones. But Twitter sent them a cease and desist letter, so they had to take down the website. So when Twitter takes down something, it's gone forever, right? Unless someone took a screenshot of it. So, but I've seen there was a Smile to Jannah channel. He actually posted some of the tweets that Tommy had said, and I'd actually shared some of the tweets on my Twitter, where he was basically like, and it was from 2011, so it was a while ago, but I've seen no evidence that he's changed. But he was basically, you could say, shitting on Muslims, right? He was saying not all Muslims are pedophiles, some of them are rapists too, like stuff like that. And when I posted this, people were saying, yeah, but he's not calling for violence against Muslims. Well, no shit, he's not saying we should go kill Muslims. He's not saying that. But he's still demonizing them. He's still saying, so people don't understand. And I'm not trying to say I know better than anybody else. But I took a course in university where we studied Hitler and we studied evil. And we studied how did it end up in a situation where they were treated like animals. And it doesn't happen overnight. People don't realize this. You don't turn people into these like so-called, you don't treat them like animals overnight. It happens slowly and slowly. First there was they were seen as outsiders, and it's always the same themes. Human beings, we always say the same things. We say, one, they're coming for women, they're taking women, rapists, right? Two, they're taking our jobs. That's another thing they say, right? They're ruining the economy. Three, they're poisoning our culture. The same thing has been said to Muslims in Burma, against Muslims in Burma. The same thing was said against Jews in pre-Holocaust. This is how people demonize a group slowly but surely, to the point where people don't want to do business with them anymore, and then to the point where nobody even blinks an eye when they're killed. So we as humanity, we need to stop hate in its tracks before we get to that point. Yes, he's not calling for killing Muslims. Yes, guys, we get that. But still, it's on that path, right? And I'm not saying that's what he's intending. And maybe he's changed his mind now. I don't know. But those statements were truly demonizing Muslims. They weren't just attacking Islam, right? So basically that's what I saw from it. And so let's anyone else. So let's all do a concluding remarks. It was a great conversation. It's been almost 2 hours now. So if you'd like to add anything,
I'll go first. I think that there can't be anything such as absolute free speech. There are always going to be limits, whether that's libel laws, whether that's security of the state laws, all of these kind of laws, whether it's a law to protect people from the speech of other people, things like verbal assault. You could walk up to a policeman and start swearing at him. You're not protected by free speech. So this idea, along with what Kane said, this idea that there is some ability or some enshrined right to be able to say whatever you want, whenever you want, with no consequences for yourself, is it's not a real world example, really. So yeah, thanks, gents, for a great conversation.
I can jump in if and just give my quick thoughts, if that's okay. It's something I brought up a few times during the discussion, and I think my main concern is not about whether free speech is in danger, but more about the quality and quantity of speech. And is it truthful? Is it honest? And equally, is it being evaluated correctly? And ultimately, what's the quality of the discourse that results from it? That's more my concern than absolute curbs on free speech. And I think that's a bigger topic, which is going to be an ongoing thing. But I do take Kane's point that a lot of this is actually straw manning. It's people who are saying free speech is in danger are the kind of people who think their bigoted or positions of privilege are in danger, and that's really what the issue is over there. We must, of course, guard against too much pandering, too much mollycoddling of certain viewpoints. And it's also not just about Muslims or bigotry against Muslims or criticizing Islam. The things Islam and Muslims just happen to be the biggest conversation, or one of the biggest conversations of our times. And of course, all of us have an interest in it. But it's still a very useful a case study which has implications for all other aspects of free speech, and the quality of speech. So my personal crusade is going to be about how do we have better ideas circulating and better mechanisms for countering those ideas with other ideas in the hope of getting to a shared understanding of truth. That's it. And again, yeah, thanks guys. It was lovely and really helped me in my own thinking as well.
I think that, as Kane and Shariq have pointed out, there's a lot of political capital to be made with the issue of free speech, especially, I don't know if you guys are following the Trump's current executive order linking college funding with ensuring that there is free speech on college campuses in the US. I think that is part of the issue. But yeah, it's been a great debate, and thanks guys for having me on here. And yeah, that's all I had to say.
Okay, yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I apologize for a little bit of technical difficulties we had earlier. It seems like this new setup needs a little bit of tweaking, so I hope it wasn't too bad, but I'm glad that it managed to resolve itself near the end. And that's a wrap. Thank you, guys. Do check out my blog, abdullahsameer.com, and stay tuned for more great conversations. This has been 5 Ex-Muslims signing out.